Welcome to episode 35 of the Detour 365 podcast. This is William, the host, and I'll be joined by Bill and Nathaniel this evening as we continue in the book of Exodus. And if you are familiar with the story of Exodus at all, you've likely had a question about God hardening Pharaoh's heart and how that affects free will, and also if Pharaoh's heart was hard to begin with, or if it was a combination of God working on Pharaoh. And why would God do such a thing? That's another question that we will be looking at. And this should be a fascinating discussion. We'll be jumping back and forth between different passages in the book of Exodus, starting with Exodus 7, 1 through 7, as well as several other passages. Now, we won't be looking at every single one because there are many passages that mention God hardening Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh's heart being hard, Pharaoh being stubborn. But just to list a few that we will be looking at: Exodus 3:19, Exodus 7, 1 through 7, which Bill will begin reading shortly, Exodus chapter 8, verses 18 through 19, Exodus 9, verses 13 through 17, and also Exodus 14, verses 3 through 8. Now, these are just a few of the ones that we will be looking at, and encourage you to follow along, read along on your translation of choice. And as always, we appreciate you listening, and this should be a very interesting discussion that we will have and touch on a lot of important issues. Not only dealing with the series that we're in, the humanity of God and God's interactions with Pharaoh and Moses, but also how God acts in our own life and what we can learn from the example of Pharaoh in this story.
But Adonai said to Moshe, I have put you in the place of God to Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, will be your prophet. You are to say everything I order you, and Aaron, your brother, is to speak to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people of Israel leave his land. But I will make him hard-hearted, even though I will increase my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies, my people, the sons of Israel, out of the land of Egypt with great acts of judgment. Then, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring the people of Israel out from among them, the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai.
Was that it?
Through when? Through what?
Oh, through 7.
Oh, Moshe and Aaron did exactly what Adonai ordered them to do. Moshe was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh.
Oh, very good. Exodus 8 and 15.
8 through 15?
8 and 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exodus 8 and 15.
Yep.
Moshe and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moshe cried to Adonai about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh was made hard-hearted so that he didn't listen to them, just as Adonai had said would happen.
And 8:18 through 19.
8:18 through 19?
Yes.
would suggest if you edit this, just cut out everything in between his talking. Maybe.
Probably, yeah.
Including what I just said.
But I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarms of insects will be there, so that you can realize that I am Adonai right here in the land. Yes, I will distinguish between my people and your people, and this sign will happen by tomorrow.
And chapter 9, 13 through 17.
Oops. 13 through 17.
Yeah.
Adonai said to Moshe, "Get up early in the morning, stand before Pharaoh and say to him, 'Here is what Adonai says, let my people go so that they can worship me. For this time I will inflict my plagues on you, yourself, and on your officials and your people, so that you will realize that I am without equal in all the earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with such severe plagues that you would have been wiped off the earth. But it is for this very reason that I have kept you alive, to show you my power, and so that my name may resound throughout the whole earth. Since you are still setting yourself up against my people and not letting them go."
Very good. And Exodus 14, 3 through 8.
(14, 3 through 8).
Yes.
Then Pharaoh will say that the people of Israel are wandering aimlessly in the countryside. The desert has closed in on them. I will make Pharaoh so hard-hearted that he will pursue them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will realize at last that I am Adonai. The people did as ordered. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. They said, "What have we done, letting Israel stop being our slaves?" So he prepared his chariots and took his people with him. Took 600 first-quality chariots as well as all the other chariots in Egypt along with their commanders. Adonai made Pharaoh hard-hearted, and he pursued the people of Israel as they left boldly.
Well, thank you for reading those many sections.
You're welcome.
Now, we kind of skipped around a little bit, and those were just a few of the examples where it said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hard. Pharaoh hardened his heart. So what does this all mean? And what does it mean for us? Well, the Pharaoh in the Exodus story is not named. That's kind of a place to start. We think he was Ramses II. That's kind of a popular belief. But we're not given the name of Pharaoh, and that's kind of a first clue, at least, because when we're not given the name of an individual in the Bible, it usually is a stand-in for, I guess in this case, it is a cautionary tale for us. We're supposed to put ourselves in the place of the people that are not named. You know, they're kind of anonymous, sort of. So it's interesting that someone as important as Pharaoh was not named. Aside from that, he was just the Pharaoh at the time, which says a lot in and of itself. The other questions are with God's relationship with this Pharaoh and how God deals with this individual. Is this a special? Are there special cases? Like people like Judas in the Bible, where we can look to how God deals with certain people in the Bible, but there can be a danger in assuming that that's like a typical person. Not to say that God contradicts how God deals with people, but just using Judas as an example, it's kind of like an extreme. Just like the Pharaoh is an extreme example of like somebody that's really like very stubborn and very, as you see, as you go through the story with the plague after plague, he kind of just digs in and he keeps getting more and more. There's an expression talks about in Proverbs 29:1. It's like if you keep the person who keeps stiffening their neck will be. I should have looked it up. Could you look that up?
Sure.
Because I think it has to do with this, because we see, the plagues coming and Pharaoh continuing to refuse to let the people go, and instead of changing course, he kind of keeps. It's Proverbs 29:1. So
He who remains stiff-necked after much rebuke will be suddenly and incurably broken.
So there you go. And also the other question, because I see the Pharaoh in the story as being like an archetype of he was a real person, but being an archetype of a person or us when we find ourselves in this position. Not that we're, encountering plagues or something like that, but when we kind of see God pointing us in one direction, but we kind of harden our hearts or, resist, despite kind of increasing consequences for not, for not changing course. And so, the other question we'll look at is, what does this say about our free will and choice and God's knowledge of things? And, because God tells Moses in Exodus 3, before Moses even goes into Egypt, I know that Pharaoh will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand.
Well, before we transfer over to that, I had some input on the hardening of the heart discussion.
Yes.
It seems very clear from the wording of one of these passages. One is, let my people go that they may serve me. But more strongly, yes. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. So, he will get glory over Pharaoh, so that the Egyptians shall know that he is the Lord. So, pretty clearly, the Pharaoh, if you want to look at the Pharaoh, like us putting ourselves in the position of the Pharaoh, if that's the goal of this story and what we're like, lost my train of thought. If the reason that the person's not named is so that we can put ourselves into the story, then is that saying that Pharaoh is used as a tool, a teaching tool?
I think in certain cases, God does not desire for us to...
Like, did God harden Pharaoh's heart in order that he might be a teaching tool for people to come? And furthermore...
Well, I believe since Pharaoh was going down that path, that...
Well, God specifically said that I will harden his heart. And then it goes on to say several times that God did harden his heart. And then the Israelites are like free and clear, essentially. And God hardens his heart again. And then Pharaoh's like, okay, well, I guess I'll go chase him, So Israelites are being used as a tool in order for God to make his name known in the land.
Well, it is a combination.
And it says that kind of directly here. So how do we feel about that?
It is a combination of that Pharaoh was stubborn to begin with.
Okay.
And that God allowed the hardening process to happen.
But he didn't say he allowed it to happen. He said it caused it to happen.
Yeah. Well, you basically have two responses to correction, or, in this case, these plagues, which were signs that he needed to let the people go. You could basically say, well, I'll let the people go, or go the other direction and resist even more. And my understanding of the story is that that was Pharaoh's response, and that the hardening of his heart was through the plagues and the things that were happening, and that was... So it was kind of a...
Well, but he relents. The Pharaoh relents, like, at least a couple times in there as a result of the plagues and stuff. He's like, oh crap.
Yeah,
and then it specifically says God hardened his heart.
It also says that when he saw that, things were kind of back to normal, that he changed his mind.
It does say that. Yeah. It goes back and forth, yeah. Right.
So, yeah, this is not an easy... These are not easy passages.
Yeah, it seems like the hardening of the heart definitely... Well, because it definitely says God did that. Now, he might not have done that every time directly, but it definitely says in the words that he hardened his heart. And then it says also why he hardened his heart, so that he may have glory over him, and the Israelites, or the Egyptians, might know him as God.
Well, he knew they weren't going to just let them go.
It's kind of a moral dilemma there, using a people as a tool to make your name.
Well, he knew they weren't going to just let them go, Pharaoh wasn't just going to let this free labor force, go, unless there was something really powerful making him do so.
Yeah, he wasn't impressed by the first couple, right? Because his magicians could do the same with the Nile.
Right.
And the snakes.
Yeah.
But they couldn't make the gnats. So there were a bunch of gnats.
Yeah, the gnats were
Well,
hard to make.
I think if we are looking at Pharaoh as this whole thing is a metaphor. This whole experience is a teaching metaphor for us down the road.
But also, this was to have happened.
Yes,
Right.
but I'm saying if we are looking at this experience, well,
But right
in the
not.
greatest sense,
Yeah.
the entire Bible, the entire history of the Israelites is a teaching metaphor leading people to Jesus Christ. In this particular metaphor, we have on one hand Pharaoh, who sets himself up in his society as God, as an all-powerful God. And he is denying others the opportunity to really show that he really isn't so all-powerful.
I think I see where you're headed.
He is not wanting his people to see him as weak.
So God needed to elevate the issues significantly enough that it would be publicly known.
That's right. God had to make Pharaoh grovel and say, okay, you're God, and I'm not. And it's a metaphor for today, because in our society, many people are taking it upon themselves to essentially say they are their own gods. They are the complete masters of their own lives. And if they're their own masters of their own lives, they're their own gods. They have all the power over their own life.
Well, and even if things are not...
That's a statement that relies upon the existence of God as a thing.
Well, that's true.
I do wonder, and I don't know the answer, but does history record that the Egyptians' faith in their Pharaoh was broken after this? Like, not biblical history, but we have plenty of Egyptian history. So, the reason for this was to make that happen. Did it work?
I don't know if Akhenaten follows Ramses II or not.
Well, he was different. I know that.
He was radically different.
Yeah.
Did they get rid of the Pharaoh as Godhead?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, unless that idea comes back. I mean...
Yeah, I mean, the priesthood, after Akhenaten did his thing, the priesthood of Egypt rebelled and brought back the old ways.
Yeah.
But yes, the whole concept of Pharaoh as God was overthrown.
But we haven't established that it was overthrown by this.
That's true.
The army was decimated, at least.
Yes.
And as you were saying, with people viewing themselves as
according to homework.study.com,
let's see what that says.
Explanation. The pharaoh before Akhenaten was his father Amenhotep III, who was also known as Amenhotep the Magnificent. The rule of Amenhotep III was a time of prosperity. The wife of Amenhotep II, Taya, outlived him by at least 12 years.
Huh. We see kind of this persistence in going down like if you're going down a destructive path and it keeps getting worse and worse, you do kind of have this, I don't know if you'd want to call it pride, but you can kind of see with Pharaoh doing it in this story, is the plagues are getting worse and worse, and he still doesn't let, you know,
Yeah.
he waits until it just becomes unbearable, then he lets them, you know, and even then he comes back, you know. So you can kind of see a similarity there with ourselves or people who are determined to go down a certain path. And you know, I guess this is kind of a real practical example maybe of this, but you know, you can kind of see the consequences and things gradually getting worse, but you just keep going down the same path. And I mean, you can kind of see that with Pharaoh, because he didn't want to lose this labor force, and he had the pride going, you know.
But I think that's a good lesson. But have we really set down our opinion of why his heart was hardened? Was it to elucidate that story, or was it to what?
It was to illustrate, well, on the simplest terms, it was to illustrate the power of Adonai, in the simplest way to look at it. Now, who knew that besides Pharaoh and Pharaoh's court? Probably nobody. That would not have been broadcast throughout Egypt. So Pharaoh and Pharaoh's court would have been the only ones knowing what was going on. So here we have Pharaoh being shown up before all of the other power players in Egypt.
What? So, like, one of the final consequences of this was like the death of the firstborn children, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that
and I
was.
did the math. I looked up. There was one point in time about a year ago. I looked up the population of Egypt during that time, and I think it was like, anyway, that, and like doing the math on the number of firstborn children, that would have been like 100,000 people died. Is there not a way that he could have demonstrated his power without that?
Could have.
Like Moses could have reached out his hand and made a volcano appear out in the ocean or something. I don't know. In the middle of the Nile.
Yeah.
Could have.
He could have opened a portal to Eden.
But
I
also,
don't know. I'm just thinking of something very outlandish that doesn't kill people.
But also, you have to remember that one of the points of this story was to establish
that you'll be beaten down by, not
well,
by
if you
truth, is what I
remember
was
at the
gonna say. I wasn't
beginning
gonna
of
say
the
like by
at
God,
the
but
beginning of Exodus, Pharaoh killed the
consequences of that.
firstborn of the Hebrews, the first, or the male children at least. You know, so it's kind of an echo.
So is that revenge story?
No,
I'm sorry?
Not revenge.
it's not necessarily a
and
revenge,
that's a
but
very
it's a
bad-
mirror.
But that's a bad. Why would we say that? Well, the Pharaoh did this horrible thing, so then God does the same horrible thing.
Well, they could have avoided it if they had put the
They could have
you
avoided
know
it
the
if God
lamb's
had chosen
blood
a
over
different.
the. Of course, that whole sign points to the New Testament, and
See, that was another reason for this. You know, the death of the firstborn. Now you have to remember, it's not only the firstborn human beings. It's the firstborn of the cattle. It's the firstborn of everything in Egypt. the firstborn cows, the firstborn goats.
It's almost like, what's the Avengers big bad guy that snaps his fingers?
Oh, I know you may, can't remember the name.
Almost a similar situation.
Yes, but there's, that is a mirror of what Pharaoh did to the male Jews when the Jews were relatively newly come into Egypt, when they were beginning to grow into numbers.
Yeah.
When they were beginning to become a threat, when Moses was a baby. Now, it wasn't all the time. It was only in that period as Moses was becoming an infant.
Yeah.
In that time period was when Pharaoh did this. So now we have this mirror action by Adonai killing the firstborn in Egypt. And that also sets up the establishment of the Passover, which hearkens unto the New Testament. The sacrificial lamb, the perfect sacrifice, the perfect covering for the people of God. And after that, God's people were freed.
I guess also getting back to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, I mean, God was dealing with Pharaoh as an individual, but also this whole story is much bigger than him. Yeah, but he did play an important role.
He was used as an instrument for one reason or another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or as an example or teaching tool.
But at the same time, he did have, as difficult as it is, I guess, to see, he did, and again, it's hard to say, but I do believe he could have chosen to just let them go, but he wasn't going to choose that. But
didn't sound like he had the choice for at least 12 tries.
Well, the option was there. I mean,
no, because he said he hardened his heart.
yeah.
And then
At
we
the
get
same
into your
time,
free
I mean,
will.
I mean,
discussion.
God knew that he wasn't going to let them go, But the option was there, and it's almost like as they kept going down that path, or as he kept going down that path, he got more and more committed to, not letting them go.
I can certainly see that being the case in people, but I can't get over, or I can't look past the fact that it was that God hardened his heart. It does seem to be a difficult thing to...
Is there a translation issue in this?
It starts off,
Yeah.
I know that Pharaoh's heart was hardened as it progressed. But when Moses and Aaron first came to Pharaoh, here in chapter 5, after that, Moshe and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "Here's what Adonai, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they can celebrate a festival in the desert to honor me." But Pharaoh replied, Who is Adonai that I should obey when he says to let Israel go? I don't know Adonai, and I also won't let Israel go. Right out of the chute. No God hardening his heart, no thinking about it. Who's Adonai that I should do anything for him? I'm not going to let these people go. He started right out of the gate. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, yes, Pharaoh had a choice.
Well,
Pharaoh could have let the Israelites go.
he could have let the Israelites go for a God which hadn't seemed to be there for 200 years.
400 years.
400? Well, I mean, you can't fault the guy for that. Some random dude comes out of the desert and says, hey, let on. Well, I guess he's not a random dude, but this
Would he have
exile.
known who he was? I guess
I don't
so,
know.
yeah.
What is he treated as if he knows who he is? He wouldn't have had an audience, an immediate audience with the Pharaoh. I don't know.
That's true. Yeah, he wouldn't have. I don't think if he was just a regular
And
guy.
can you really walk up to the edge of the Nile and just talk to the Pharaoh as he does his little morning walk?
Yeah, I'm
doubt
pretty
that.
sure. I'm pretty sure Pharaoh knew exactly who Moses was
Yeah.
when Moses came out of the desert.
Yeah.
And came to court.
'Cause
I don't think that was a surprise at all, because Pharaoh would have said,
I feel like that's
"Let
the thing
this
you just
joker in."
I feel like that's just the thing you get killed for back then. You try to tell the Pharaoh what to do. Like,
Well, that's true. It is
Uh-huh.
kind of miraculous that Moses wasn't killed.
yeah. Walk into the king's room and tell him what to do. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. He would at least get put in jail for that.
But Moses, who was a prince of Egypt, comes up and throws down the gauntlet. Adonai says, "Let my people go."
I guess he did do the signs for Pharaoh.
Eh,
The initial signs, right?
Otherwise, he
Adonai.
may strike us with a plague or with the sword. The king of Egypt answered them, "Moshe and Aaron, what do you mean by taking the people away from their work? Get back to your labor."
Yeah, I mean, his first answer wasn't just no. It was, they're going to make bricks without straw now. It's making the situation worse than what it was.
Does that make the bricks weaker?
Yes, you can't make bricks without straw.
Well, they had to gather their own straw, right?
Mm-hmm. The bricks won't hold together.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, yeah.
Oh, do they mix the straw into the brick?
Yeah, I think the cellulose is like reinforced concrete, like steel.
Oh.
Like,
When you're making bricks out of mud
Yeah.
and you're baking them in the sun, if you don't have the straw,
it'll be very fragile, I think.
yes.
Well, that's an interesting illustration because I was thinking of like the stiff-neckedness and stubbornness, and if something is strong, if it's too rigid, it's often brittle and it breaks. Versus if something has,
Because you could say that would be unable to adapt.
yes. But something that is actually really strong or anti-fragile it can adapt, I guess, there was a book called Anti-Fragile or something. It was like a concept that, I don't want to get too off topic, but, that ideally people should be, like our bodies can adapt to challenges, and not being able to adapt is not a sign of strength. It's a sign that, I mean, there is a time where you stand your ground on certain things, but not being willing to adapt at all, or to, I guess I've kind of gotten way off topic on that.
Being unable to receive
instruction.
Reasoned challenges.
Pharaoh was very stubborn, and he was...
Or different ways of doing things.
He acted like he was... And he did have the authority of being the Pharaoh, but at the same time, his pride was his weakness in a way, because he wasn't able to... it led to his own destruction in this case.
Well, what did I remember back in the desert when God approached Moses?
Yeah.
And he told him, I want you to go to Egypt and demand this of Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart. But what was his exact words there?
I know that he will not let them go. I think that's what his words were. It was in chapter 3, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That we looked at. That was one verse, but I think that there was more there. There was more than just 3:19. So I can get my Bible out of here.
I would look, but my phone is recording. Would anyone care for more coffee?
Yes, sir.
It's all you. Let's see.
I know that the king of Egypt will not let you leave unless he is forced to do so. But I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will do there. After that, he will let you go.
So God does foretell what will happen. And yeah, I mean, I definitely see that Pharaoh was a real person that God had hardened the heart of in this case. But also, this story and this example not only was a lesson for the people at that time, but for us as well. And so I did want to touch on this. This is a little bit of a side topic, but since we're talking about, the symbolism or the archetype of Pharaoh, Egypt is a location that comes up quite a bit in the Bible. And I was thinking, what does Egypt stand for? Well, not like as a people, but like because it is a location that comes up again and again. And it's significant because not only do the people spend 400 years there before Moses leads them out, but Jesus goes to Egypt like right after he was born. They flee to Egypt. They wait there. So it seems like you could see that Egypt is I guess symbolizes, kind of like the wilderness, like, there's the wilderness symbolism of, wandering in the wilderness, and just as a location, I see it as like a waiting place, because anytime anybody ever goes to Egypt in the Bible, it's like, well, I mean, it was a refuge in times of famine, for sure. But I just find it interesting that, at least in this case, that they were waiting in Egypt for 400 years, and that also had to do with stuff going on in the Promised Land and the Amorites and the
400 years is a long time.
The timing of all that. Yeah, I mean, it's a long time to wait.
I was just thinking about that in regards to, like, Pharaoh's reaction.
Yeah.
It's like something had been going on since 1624. Like,
yeah.
That's a long time ago.
Yep.
Things had been that way for 400 years.
Yeah.
Could hardly expect his reaction to be.
Well, and we read stories in the Bible, like the story of Joseph, that he was in prison for years. And, it's like you read one sentence and he's in prison, then he's like out of prison, then the next paragraph. But in that paragraph, years happened. So it's easy to kind of not see, or it's easy to just kind of read past that, just like in the Exodus story, like, 400 years. To us it's one sentence, but there were how many generations that lived and died during that time that never knew anything else, and I guess it's kind of a humbling thing when you think about God's timing, because
12 generations.
Yeah. It's a lot.
But Egypt...
Is there any reason established for why he waited 400 years to do something about their enslavement?
Well, I know there was a people group that was occupying the land that they were supposed to come back to and take possession of, and the iniquity of the Amorites was what God said to Abraham, the iniquity of the Amorites, right, was complete or something. That there was this people group that lived there.
There was a bunch of stuff needed to happen in the Promised Land before they came. They needed to be a peoples.
Well, that's true, yeah.
They needed to be a cohesive group, before they took possession of the land.
So at that point, they did have, I guess one of the strongest ways for a group to form a group identity is shared suffering.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what happened in Egypt.
So 400-year team building exercise.
Well, it also permitted them to grow in size to where they would be a formidable people.
Yeah, because when they first arrived in Egypt, when Joseph and brought his brothers and their family, they were just 72, roughly 72 people, and then 400 something.
Well, they must have
later,
intermarried with the Egyptians, because you can't reproduce without problems with less than 300 people.
Absolutely.
You think they did? I mean,
there
were other people.
They had to
groups
have. Only
there
72
too, right?
people is not enough to form a.
There were other
a decent genetic
people there
group,
too,
yeah.
Right?
You're looking. Go on.
That makes them more than half Egyptian, by the way, because 72 is not half of 300, unless they were inbred.
Probably. Well, I mean, Joseph had an Egyptian wife.
Yeah.
Right.
But you have to remember,
But I guess people's identity is not based on.
Yeah.
That's an interesting topic in and of itself.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true.
Your cultural identity does not rely upon your race.
Well, the Egyptians definitely
suppose,
saw them
yeah.
as separate. And what would have been an identifier of a Hebrew versus an Egyptian? Would it have been the god that they
the Hebrews
served?
were-
Or would the...
Jewish people are not darker skinned. Egyptian people are portrayed as kind of bronze. I don't know. They look different.
You're probably
right?
thinking of like Ashkenazi Jews, which are like kind of European.
yeah,
Jews.
Ashkenazi are more European, but your regular Hebrew is a Semitic folk, and they are darker.
Yeah, but nowadays there are different kinds of.
Whenever I think of Jewish people, I just think of like white people, kind of.
The ones here. Well, I mean, there are some Arab Jews in.
Yeah, because they would have all been Arabs in the story.
Yeah.
Right? Well, but then again, Egyptian. I don't know.
You have to remember, it was, in this time, it was more clannish. You have to remember, they would have grown into 12 families. So, and these families would have been identified as cohesive groups by the fact that the male children were circumcised.
Yeah.
Through all these generations, the male children would have been circumcised.
So that was a sign, I guess, as well. I mean, I don't think the Hebrews would have worshipped the Egyptian.
No, they would not have worshipped the Egyptian gods.
But without, Moses was the guy who penned the Torah. Right?
Yes.
So before Moses, they were there for 400 years. They had like an oral tradition, I guess,
Yeah. They knew
But they
that they
didn't.
were descendants of Abraham.
Yeah. So they kind of held on to that.
And they knew that there was a promise.
Yeah.
I promise.
That
They
would
loosely knew that there was a promise.
that they would be delivered and
But mostly they knew that they were descended from the same family.
yeah. So this time in Egypt is interesting because it was and I guess we could see certain phases of our own lives in this, that Egypt was a relatively safe place as far as protection from famine and invading armies and that kind of thing, but at the same time it allowed them to grow into a cohesive people, very numerous, but at the same time they weren't free while they were there. So it was kind of a trade-off. It was a time of waiting. They were secure, but they weren't free, and they were waiting to be delivered. So it was kind of a mix of a blessing and a curse. It was a hard time, but God used it to bless them in a weird way because they multiplied and they grew and developed an identity. And there were probably many people who lived during that time that really resented being in slavery, really resented being there. But if they hadn't been there, they would have been vulnerable to all the larger nations around them. Because Abraham, when he was living out in the place that they were going to come back to, he was it Abraham or it was Jacob that the sons took revenge on the and he was concerned that
Jacob.
the people around him were going to,
Yeah.
you
Jacob.
know, it's like, you've made me a stench to the people around me, and then, because they were kind of sojourners. They weren't really like, they had servants, they had some power, but they weren't like a nation or anything like that.
They had a group large enough of fighting guys to keep them from, getting slaughtered, but they weren't an army by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
And, we look at them at this time in Egypt, and there again we get back to the whole family thing. They became thousands in each family, and they were all part of this one greater family. And that would have been what they knew. They were all slaves, but they weren't hungry.
Yeah.
They were safe. They weren't free, but they weren't hungry, unless they really messed up and didn't do their work.
And in keeping with this series, we're told throughout. I gotta be careful how I word this, but we're told throughout, especially the Old Testament, God does say, "I am a jealous God." So how? And I'll let you open that, unpack that. Because it's kind of like when people hear that, it's like, well, does God have an ego that he gets offended? But I guess if he's rightfully the master of the universe, doesn't necessarily mean you have an ego if you're
Really,
right.
the master of the universe. He is a jealous God in that it is important that his creation knows him. You gotta think back to the beginning. The reason he created humankind was to have a relationship. And here is his creation not having a relationship with him.
Well, even the people he chose.
That's their free will.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, you got to have the option to accept or reject.
You have the option, but you have to be willing to pay the price of your choice.
And also the people that, I know we've kind of been, beating up on Pharaoh saying he was stiff-necked, but the Hebrews themselves, when they come to the Promised Land, they go through all these cycles and phases where they turn to God, then things are going well, then they, it describes them as a stiff-necked and stubborn people. They keep, even when they're wandering in the wilderness, they make the golden calf and they do all this other stuff that.
The price thing, and I'm sorry, I did not absorb what you said there that much because I was trying to hang on to what my dad
Hang
said.
on to
it. That's a heck of a choice to offer somebody. Saying, you have free will, but you can either serve me or suffer eternally. That's like saying to somebody in your house, serve me or I will torture you every day for the rest of your life. But you got free will, don't worry. No sweat.
You can do whatever you want to.
Yeah.
Crazy. The reason you exist is to know me. That's the whole reason for your existence.
Yeah.
Is to know me, to relate to me, to be with me. That is the entire reason that you exist.
So we're pets.
Now, you can choose not to do that, but you will have to accept the consequences of your choice.
Okay, let me say that in a video game,
I see
Like,
what you're saying.
if I create, well, let's just make it a video game. If I create a little people
Sure.
in a video game,
Uh-huh.
I say, well, or let's say I create an animal, a species of animal,
Okay.
and it's like, well, I've created you. You can worship me, or I will torture you forever, or I will let you be tortured forever. That's morally
Well,
questionable.
I think worship is, I think the whole point of worshiping is questionable. Yes, we
You mean
call
the
it
concept of
we
it?
call it worship,
Or-
but God wants an intimate relationship with us.
Well, and the torture part, as far as I've understood it is separation from God. So, when you think of like hell, I mean, we have these images of fire and all that stuff, but it's more like you're getting what you want, for lack of a better way of saying it, because you're choosing, well, I don't want God at all.
Well, in my mind, it's not a choice of want. Want is a misplaced thing
Yeah.
when it comes to like finding what is true. And I can only determine what is true by what I can observe.
Well, it almost
understand.
takes a desire to know God and believe that you could have a relationship with God to know what those options are in a way, because there are a lot of people that joke around like, oh yeah, I'll see you in hell, I'm going,
Yeah.
I'm a son of anarchy or whatever,
Well,
but they don't really know what they're saying.
I don't know. I think we
it's like
ought to be careful not to question
there
the
are people
discomfort
that
of hell,
worship the
because
devil.
like,
There are people like Satanists.
hell
that,
is widely regarded as hell, right?
I would like to.
It is supposed to be
I
eternal
would.
torture, right?
I would like to. Well, the scripture doesn't exactly say that, but it does say.
Oh, let me make sure my phone's still recording. It did a thing. It is. See, hell to me, I would just say my interpretation of God is that God represents what truth is. I'm not saying the same thing as that I believe necessarily in God.
Okay.
I don't believe that God doesn't exist. I just don't.
No.
Period. I just don't know. Yeah. It would be illogical for me to make either statement in my mind. But it's my understanding, because I don't want to. I would normally use the word belief, which I guess it is. Belief, and because you have to, let me establish what belief means to me. Belief would be like your best guess based on available evidence. Because it's my belief that I know something about like how electricity functions, or like it's my belief you don't know down to subatomicness of everything that you do every day, and yet you still believe that like if you flip on the light switch, the lights are going to turn on, right? So to me, that's what belief would be. But it's my belief that God is represented by the idea of truth, and that like developing a relationship with God is synonymous with developing an ability to embrace truth, and that the more that you embrace truth, the more you will be essentially rewarded in life, and because that's the best you can do, even if and the more you stray from the ability to embrace truth, you will create your own hell. Like, in a very real sense in the world.
I was thinking of a good example would be like using that would be like cognitive dissonance is kind of a hell. You know, like there are people who reject, if there's something that they know is true, but they still reject it, and they choose to be essentially tortured kind of by, even if they don't see it as being tortured, it causes you to have, if you have cognitive dissonance, it causes you to suffer, even if it's not consciously, it causes like a incongruency, right, in the person.
Yeah.
So I guess using that example, that's kind of a, you know, not that people necessarily want to be tortured, but they might prefer to hang on to, just like Pharaoh preferred to hang on to pride or preferred to hang on to, you know, whatever it was, even though things kept getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I think all the lessons that we can learn from the Bible and are pretty much true. They seem true, like the moral and social and whatever, practical, philosophical, whatever, all those good words. The lessons that you glean from this seem true, without offering a fully detailed explanation as to why, except for belief, which I think is a good thing for, especially for uneducated people of the past. I don't want that to be a negative.
I gotcha.
I would like to speak for just a moment.
Sure.
From Scripture about, we were talking about, you know, hell and eternal torment and all of that a few minutes ago.
Yep.
And I would like to read from chapter 20 of the Revelation of Jesus in the Scripture, verses 12 and following through the end of the chapter.
So Revelation 20.
Revelation 20.
Oh, Revelation. Yeah.
It's actually the revelation of Jesus.
To John.
To John.
Yeah.
And I saw the dead, both great and small, standing in front of the throne. Books were opened, and another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged from what was written in the books, according to what they had done. The sea gave up the dead in it, and death and Sheol gave up the dead in them, and they were judged, each according to what he had done. Then death and Sheol were hurled into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was hurled into the lake of fire.
That does sound unpleasant.
Yep.
Now, I don't know about eternal torment, but the whole concept of being tossed into a lake of fire
does not appeal to me.
Yes.
But it is kind of almost like Pharaoh. If you look at the example of Pharaoh, like it's almost like he's like, well, I don't care what the consequences are, but he does kind of shrink back on a few occasions when things get
he does get comfortable again, and then he gets uncomfortable, and then he gets comfortable, and it's like but so some of that happens, but also some of the heart hardening happens from an external source.
Yeah.
In order to make a point.
Yeah.
It seems.
So he vacillates.
But As far as the importance of, I'm just trying to kind of wrap up my own thought process since I kind of expounded on that already. I do believe that belief is important, even if I don't know that I am capable of choosing. Anyway, I think that belief is important for people because, well, I've touched on this before, but because it enables you to do things that aren't strictly logical, but also because, like, such as persist when it becomes illogical, only pretty much only people that persist past the point of logic and odds will be the most successful, often, or even be successful at whatever your judgment of successful means. But also belief creates the proper creates the fear in you of going against that belief. It makes you, yeah.
Why should there be any fear? If there is no God, why should there be any fear of going against anything?
Consequences to yourself and people that you care about, ideas that are important to you.
I mean, if there are no gods, if there is no God, there are no absolutes. And if there are no absolutes, there's not really much point in it.
I would argue that there are absolutes. Well, I don't want to be careful about saying that statement. I think what you mean by absolutes is there is no absolute right or wrong. Right? Is that what you meant by that?
We can start there.
Indeterminable to determine right and wrong.
Who set the absolute truth?
Yeah.
Or established
and
it?
It's my belief that absolute truth does exist independent of any supernatural power. It's just what is presented in religious texts, for the most part, and I can't pick out any, well, I have brought up some possible moral issues in the past, but represents a very good guidepost and, direction for what truth is. It's like, and I can't say that I originated this idea, I guess, but it's a summation of the collective wisdom and truth of thousands of years of millions of people, and all the lessons they've learned. And that's why there's so much depth to this, that it is something in which you can believe and be right almost all the time.
But what makes it absolute?
Because of it, well, what makes it absolute, the other side of that is that in these lessons, you can parse out why things are important in a substantial way. Like why is not stealing from people important or something, right? It's, in my mind, it's not because God says it's important. It's because if you want to have a successful society which outcompetes other societies, or is optimal in some fashion, you don't steal from one another. You work together. Humans are a cooperative species, and that's why we've come to the top. If we just stole from one another and went around murdering and pillaging willy-nilly, weren't this competitive species capable of working with people, then we would not be at the top.
But we have theft and lying and murdering going on in our society literally all of the time.
Yes, but our society relies on the fact that the average is still above that board.
But I see it as part of the design, though, that God intended for stealing to not be a good thing to do. therefore,
Valid. Yeah, seems
you know.
valid interpretation to me. Anyway, whatever that's worth. There's
But anyway.
Well, if you,
I think someone is calling.
Somebody is calling. Oh, somebody is. But I'll let that go for now.
That's my idea, is that absolute truth does exist. Like you can't say, or it would be, because I always used to ask, well, sometimes I do, I would wonder these like impossible to figure out things, like what's the highest a butterfly has ever flown in history? Right? Like, it exists.
yes.
That absolutely exists, and it is measurable. But, like, are we ever going to be able to measure that? Maybe, but not certainly with anything within our current imagination. Well, that's not true. Within imagination, you could time travel and do all kinds of crazy stuff, whatever. But it's
God
just something
knows
that's
how high up.
currently, like,
Yeah.
way impossible. All right. It's way impossible to measure, right? But it doesn't mean that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And also, like, where you have moral dilemmas, like societal moral dilemmas, like, should we tax this people 12% or 5% or 12, you know?
Yeah.
There is actually a perfect solution to that. But you've got so many different variables within society. Think of all the, like, literally billions of variables that you can change within a society. Like all the tiny little details. How much does Starbucks coffee cost? You know, all of those variables go into computing essentially what the net result of that culture or that civilization or that people. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't fathom finding the perfect solution to these billions of variables. Right, but we do our best. We kind of do our best by argument, and that's why you have to anyway.
But I guess
all the competing different ideas compete to find something that's as close as we can do as humans to what is true.
But I guess that.
So absolute truth exists, even if we can't find it in the infinite detail, or almost near infinite detail.
I guess what I'm getting at is what the
truth.
source of the absolute truth is.
Results.
You know, and I would say it's, God establishes the absolute truth. I mean, we can search it out and try to find it.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, we're given, we're not given the answer to, like, how high a butterfly can fly.
What's an example of something that requires absolute truth to you? Or like,
well, I mean, that's.
Will my spirit reside with God?
Yeah. I don't even enjoy this conversation.
In
Well, I
eternity.
do, but I don't. Because I don't actually wish to dissuade anyone of their faith. That is not.
Well, I mean, God knows how many hairs are on your head, it says that in the Bible. But, I mean, I don't necessarily know the answer to that question,
Yeah.
And for most of us, like me, that's a dynamic number.
My brain just
It
works
is a
from the
dynamic
bottom.
number.
It feels like it works from the bottom up, and I have to put things together like Legos, and if I see a hole in the Legos, it really bugs me.
Faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Is it a hole or is it a Lego
Here's a question.
donut model?
Is everyone capable of faith? Well, okay. That's a question. I know
so.
how you would answer that. So I'll
I mean,
cut you off.
you have faith that when you walk outside, you're not going to get hit by a meteorite.
Do I have faith, or just I think the chances are low, so I'm not that scared of it?
I have a belief that when I walk outside, I won't be hit by a meteorite.
We hope you're not.
I have faith that if I'm hit by a meteorite,
I don't know about
I
you.
will join God
There you go.
for eternity.
Every time before I walk out the door, I pray that I won't get hit. No.
All it takes is a really tiny one,
That's right.
Yeah.
the size of a marble or less. Grain of sand.
Size of a grain of sand traveling at 22,000 miles an hour will do us in.
Yeah.
Make a neat little hole completely through us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what
I
the
guess
fastest,
it would depend upon where it would
to
fit us.
completely derail this, you know what the fastest man-made object is?
What?
A
A
what?
manhole cover.
Oh, a manhole cover.
A manhole cover.
Oh, it blew up.
They
Right.
detonated a nuclear test device in a very
Yeah.
deep, like essentially well, and had a steel plate over the top of it.
Uh-huh.
They recorded it with a very high-speed camera, and this camera took so many thousands of pictures per second. I think it was back in like 1960, so it was only measured in thousands, because we can do millions and millions of frames per second now.
Yeah.
But anyway, it only appeared in two frames.
Huh.
So they could, but it did appear in multiple frames, and they knew the refresh or the frame rate of this camera. They determined that it was traveling at like, I don't know, like 170,000 miles an hour.
Wow.
Like they literally blasted this like foot-thick steel plate, like past the point, like it's like Voyager 1 and 2.
Yeah.
You know, they escape velocity for the solar system.
Yeah.
Well, so did this
Manhole cover.
manhole cover.
Huh.
Gee whiz. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yet, when you stop to think about it, getting back to Pharaoh being hard-hearted,
Yeah.
God, if you presume that there is a God, making us hard-hearted in situations can be instrumental in us being used as a tool.
Well,
there you go.
I
there
might be
was-
wrong about the fastest. It might not be the fastest, but
Well,
it was
when I
definitely
said
the first
when I
thing.
said
Anyway,
whip,
sorry.
that was not a good answer. But that
Oh.
was the first object to break the sound barrier.
Yeah, sounds
Man-made
right.
object.
Yeah.
Crack of the whip.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just, in case somebody was listening, they were like, "Why did he say
That may have been the first thing to break the sound barrier.
Or a meteorite probably was, but
Well, you said
That's
man-
not a man-made
you said
object.
not a man-made object. Oh, I did find an interesting quote because I listened to a video that was a part of a video about this. We were talking about kind of the two different, that Pharaoh could have responded and said, like, okay, well, I realize that this God is the God and I'm going to let the people go, But instead, his heart was hardened.
Yeah. What if
There was-
Moses had got in there with a less combative attitude?
Yeah.
Just been like, I totally know, I understand, 'cause it's been 400 years since this guy meant anything to you or, your people or anything. Like, can you just let me, like, step over here and I'll make the Nile flow up into the air for a second. We'll just, I don't know.
Well, there was an interesting quote, and I'm probably going to not get it quite right, but, it was talking about that, let's say God was applying pressure and heat, metaphor, to this situation.
Well, they sort of did that to the people, the
Yeah.
Israelites.
But if you apply like pressure and heat to clay, it hardens, But
Yes.
other material would melt, So it's kind of like what was your state beforehand? You might have a tendency to become more
Fluid.
stubborn and stiff-necked, or be
What is your lowest energy
Slowly.
state?
yeah.
Is it a crystal lattice or? I don't know.
You turn into a diamond.
Yeah.
But it does make a difference.
Yeah.
Um,
Although the heat is
Um,
not low energy.
God does appreciate when we think about these different things. God gave us a brain so that we could consider these things.
Yeah.
Because God does want us to think.
Do you think that this, or do you believe that passages like this that are difficult, that it was perhaps one of God's intents to make us have to pause and consider, because the Bible really, you have to, the Bible's very difficult, I mean, if not impossible to understand just reading through it and not, if you're just somebody that's just reading through it and not trying to understand it, it's not going to make sense. Of course, I mean, well, I guess that's obvious, but
well, I know what you mean. I know what you mean, and that's also a tough statement to take. It's not as easy to
understand as like a.
It's kind of, but that's kind of a.
I drove my car down the road and ran over a squirrel.
What's the word? What's the word that people? I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off.
No, well, I was just saying it's different than a story that like I drove my car down the road and a raccoon jumped onto the windshield and I swear, it's like.
Yeah. I mean, it is, I guess it's necessary to say something like, well, you have to, it is often, I think, necessary to ask people, reasonably ask people, hey, you have to, like, attempt to understand what I'm saying. You have to listen and, like, sort of, like, try to understand what I'm saying. Yeah. But also I think that can be taken too far if you start to just overthink it. You can turn into, like, what is it when you, like, kind of go into someone's brain and delegitimize their own thoughts?
Gaslighting?
Yes, that's it. Can be kind of gaslighty if your answer is ultimately just like, well, you have to, like, let's think this around until it makes sense, because that's also not quite the.
Well, I believe it's written in such a way, and again, you might say there's circular logic, but it's written in such a way that we need divine help to really understand. Because a lot of these stories, even this story about Pharaoh, and I mean almost any story in the Bible, especially the further back you go into Genesis, you can read it 100 times and see something different you can get something slightly different that's helpful each time, but you're not going to get it all at once.
Yeah, kind of like Chinese fortune cookies, though.
Yeah,
I think they're Chinese. Or the
Oriental fortune cookie.
Yeah, or the what's the chart that you go to some Chinese or Chinese restaurants and you look and you're like, I'm the rabbit. It's the year of the rabbit or something. Your horoscope, like, and I don't mean to. I'm only comparing that to say, like,
the I Ching.
Like, you can read into things, into your own. You can read your personal experience into a lot of things and pull meaning out of it without, from a lot of sources. It doesn't make the Bible unique in that, or I don't know. I don't think that was my original intent.
These are definitely stories that, like in Pharaoh, for example, you can definitely see yourself. I mean, ideally, we're not acting like that all the time, but, that is a cautionary tale that you don't want to go down that path,
Yeah. Be like water.
Yeah. But yeah,
a grasshopper.
Yes. Right. Well,
it's important as we read these things, as you were saying, that you read them a number of times. because you will get something different out of them almost every time. And if you have a belief in God, you will get something different than many other people. I know that, there was a period in my life when I was not a follower of Jesus. I practiced Buddhism. I did a number of things in my life. And, but I know that as I came back, the more I read and approached God with sincerity, I came to understand things in the scripture that I had never understood before. And I don't know if that was just me being thick as a brick or God's divine hand showing me something that he wanted me to see.
And building on that, and also something that's good to, not that we have to close right now, but something to keep in mind as we look at the stories in the Old Testament. That the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus, and if you want the perfect example of what God's character is like, at least as Christians, we believe that Jesus is representative of that. So, in these stories, it might seem like, God's being unfair or unmerciful to Pharaoh, and it can be hard to wrestle with that.
What's interesting is that Jesus is actually portrayed as kind of, I don't want to say superior, but he seems I don't think Jesus is portrayed as being jealous, for instance, or as getting, well, I think we addressed in the past that Jesus has gotten angry.
Yeah, well, and he laments over
getting
the
angry
fact
is a
that
natural
people,
I think acting from anger is the thing you could criticize.
Well, yeah, and he makes some statements
Well,
about himself
yeah.
that, you may not consider him jealous,
yeah.
but when he says, I am the only way to the Father, that's exclusionary.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Sure.
Well, and he does lament over,
standards, like
Jerusalem and the people, that, you weren't willing.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying, I'm not sure if.
Yeah.
I feel like you're sort. My kind of point to that was that it almost feels to me that Jesus is portrayed as being. This is a bold statement, I guess, but morally superior to how God is presented a lot of times. Like the overall picture of how God acts, especially in the Old Testament,
the Old Testament, yeah.
is like Jesus is I would say, portrayed as a more perfect individual.
Well, he was also sent to save. He wasn't sent to necessarily judge during that time that he was here.
It was important that it is important that we remember that Jesus is perfectly illustrated by the character of God as displayed throughout the Old Testament. Now, we might not want to think about that, but if we look, again, getting back to the entirety, from Genesis through the revelation of Jesus to John, the character of Jesus that we see in the New Testament at the end is perfectly illustrated in the Old Testament.
I don't understand.
He is all powerful. He is a God of justice. He is, on one hand, merciful, and on the other hand, absolutely relentless.
I mean, the language he uses towards the Pharisees sometimes. It's like, but I mean,
that I feel like it's an interesting consideration, because I feel like there is some difference between the way God, if you were to like summarize how God is portrayed throughout the entire Bible, like the average, I feel like it would not be the exact same as how Jesus is portrayed. And whether
well,
it
if
varies
you look at Jesus
in
in
either
Revelation
direction,
too,
I think
so.
that's an interesting conversation. Like,
Well,
even if
yeah.
God
It's
is
an interesting
portrayed as more
conversation,
perfect
If you
or less perfect, either way,
if you do not include the book of Revelation,
we can't pick and choose.
well, I'm just saying, if
Yeah.
you do not
Well, we
include
can't.
the book of Revelation,
We can't.
then you can say that Jesus is seemingly different in some ways from the character that we see of God in the Old Testament.
In the book of Revelation, he gets angry or something, or
Well,
No,
that's when
he
the
is
judgment happens. It's kind of like
he
you know,
becomes
it's like-
the absolute. Yep, we
Well,
see the absolute
holding
God.
people to the standard which you established is not. There's nothing bad about that at all.
Well, that's exactly what he does in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
He holds
Now, whatever that
people to
standard
the
is,
standard
you
that
can
he
argue that, but-
established from the beginning,
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So you can include that.
and that's what he does.
Well, he does say during his earthly ministry in the in the Gospels that I haven't come to judge right now. Like that's not my purpose. Like right now. At least that's how I read it. Like the judgment's going to happen, but this is
I
my
have
purpose
come to
here is
save
to
the
save
lost.
the lost and give you an opportunity, which I think also speaks to the situation with Pharaoh. It's that you do get to a point where God gives us. I guess Pharaoh's not necessarily the perfect example, but God gives us a lot of off ramps. If we're going down the wrong path, we have a lot of off ramps, but you do reach a point
Off ramps
where
from the bad path.
but
Yes.
you do to get onto the quote unquote good path. But you do get to a point where if you persist and you go down, and you don't know exactly what point that is, but get to the end of your life,
Point of no
it's just
return.
kinda like,
The
okay, you
Event
chose
horizon.
this way,
Yeah, and I mean we see it while Christ is on the cross.
Yeah, I mean,
The
but
two
that-
who are crucified with him. There's one guy that says, I understand where you are, please, and Jesus tells him, today you'll be with me in paradise.
Yeah.
Jesus knows our heart. He can take that perfect snapshot of our heart, and that is upon what we are judged.
no,
And-
it's not. Well, you have to be more specific. It's not just is your heart like good. It's like is your heart accepting of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are a lot of good people that are not going to make it into heaven.
Relatively good seeming people.
Yes. Society, we call them good people.
Good neighbors.
Yes.
State Farm?
State Farm.
That's right.
Which they are not a sponsor of this.
But
We should call them up.
But Jesus is the one who can see who we really are.
If they're not a sponsor, why are you in khaki? And no.
But you know, that's important, and I believe we have all been hard-hearted. We've all been. I know I've been stubborn at times in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm definitely, I would say, stubborn.
You were to some extent your father's child. I know you're stubborn.
I think that if we are to directly equate what is in my mind a unwillingness to set down the like parsing things through my ability to make reason out of them, I wouldn't say that that's, I don't know, I guess that's stubbornness. But we are supposed to use our own heads, right? But
We are supposed to use our own heads.
We've been given them.
Yeah.
But you know,
I've
put yourself.
I've been placed in a world which is governed by physical rules, which we can observe and everything else.
That's right.
A relatively difficult thing to ask me to believe in something that obeys none of those.
I think God obeys his own rules.
I mean, physics.
God obeys his own rules,
Well,
pretty much.
If you create physics, you can, make your own physics, right?
I haven't seen any of that transmutation of staves into serpents, but
You know, we don't know by what mechanism that is done. You know, there are things that we know today that, you know, when I was in high school, we only knew about 104 elements.
Today we know about portals and wormholes and all kinds of things.
We know so much more than we did when I was growing up and learning more every day. Look at what we have learned in the last 6 months. We put up one telescope and look at how that is altering.
You talking about James Webb?
Yeah, James Webb. We put up that one telescope and look at how it is shaking the very foundations of cosmology.
What, the crisis in cosmology?
Yeah.
And this is probably, well, I mean, I know we've kind of gone on, but I did want to kind of posit this, throw this out there. I think it's something we've talked about before, that God is still creating creation, and, that it's, because there's so many things that, like, I could have sworn that, like, this didn't exist years ago. And I'm struggling to think of an example, but I guess, like, different things.
This apartment building did not exist when I was a youth.
I think William's going for one of those. I think I see
that make people think that some people draw the conclusion like, oh, it's the Mandela effect or
Exactly.
something.
That's what
It's
I thought you were
like
going for.
I don't remember that at all. I remember that can be completely different, but or it wasn't as weird. Like it seems like there's more and more.
Well,
like the universe is being built out.
The universe is,
I
from
don't know
my
how to
understanding,
describe
being
it.
built out. So outside the
Yeah.
relatively finite gravity, and gravity is a exponentially decreasing. I don't want to say force because it's actually a time. Time is actually what the speed of time passage is actually what creates gravity. If you look that up, or if you do some research into that. Anyway, but outside of the influence of strong gravitational sources, the universe does seem to be increasing in size, like that dark energy stuff.
Well, it's almost like the more I look, and I know the more I look into things, the more I see. I don't know how.
But like there's some expanding force, or expanding we'll just say expanding force that acts upon kind of like all of the universe, like throughout its.
It's almost like as soon as
dimensions. Well, hang on.
Yeah.
Please. But where gravity exists, like gravity wells, like planets and suns and galaxies and stuff, that pulling inward force, in addition to dark matter, which is 70% of that or something, that overwhelms the expanding force. But in the places between galaxy clusters, which is most of what's there, or isn't there, that's where that expansion really happens. And you can see that in the redshift effect, where the light waves have actually been stretched, like the first light that was released through the universe.
I guess what I'm getting at is then,
CMB
like, 10 years from now we're going to find out, or 50 years from now we're going to find out, well, actually, it's completely different.
And that's the beauty of science.
There's purple shift, and that's...
Well...
there's going to be something... It's almost like every time you feel like you've arrived, like God throws something else into the picture, and you're like, oh, well, I guess we didn't know all there was about this. Even things in the Bible, just I think that I know this story really well, but then somebody will point something out. I'll be like, oh,
yeah, well, science
I
is
never
not
saw that.
the elimination of uncertainty; it's the reduction of uncertainty.
Yeah, but
so nothing in science ever, if you're no true person that would say they like science.
I guess there's just been a lot of like Mandela effecty kind of stuff, for lack of a better way of, stuff that and I don't think it's just that I'm getting older and I learn more and see more things. I think there's something, and I probably sound like a crazy person, but
I don't believe you sound like a crazy person, but I do believe
we're all a little crazy.
That I do not think that things are changing. I do think that as time progresses, humankind is finding out how much more there is that we do not know.
Well, maybe that's it. It almost feels like, I don't know. Well, I guess another example would be experiences people have, or, like I grew up, I guess I grew up when I was younger with the idea that, and again, this is not my belief right now, but, God only raised people from the dead or did really big things like back in the Bible days, and that stuff doesn't happen. But, the more you you hear about more and more things happening, and that could just be the availability of information about different things happening around the world, or just people having these supernatural experiences. And it might have been that years ago people just didn't talk about it because they didn't want to seem like they were nuts or something, but it just seems more and more commonplace that the more I didn't know this, the number of people having that, the percentage of people that have like near death experiences or some sort of out of body experience, that it's actually fairly, if you would have asked me years ago, I would have said maybe 1 in 10,000 people has something like that. But it's, if you really get down to it, I mean, they've done surveys that it's like 30% or so, something like that. And you just kind of like, oh, I didn't know. If it was 1 in 10,000, I could think like, well, maybe that person has schizophrenia or something.
Well,
but if it's like a
I had an
sizable,
out-of-body experience.
and I'd have 2, not an extended one, but that's another story for another day. But
there are things like that do impact our concepts of reality.
or all these people that disappear in the national parks, all this weird stuff, I'm not saying God's doing that or anything like that, but I meant just I just come to the increasing conclusion that there's a lot of supernatural.
Well, I think we all
stuff
search
at work,
or hope for, and or search for. When I was a child, I remember looking at a poster of like the rainforest, the different levels of rainforest in the classroom in my kindergarten or first grade classroom, and first or second grade classroom actually. And I remember just like sort of feeling that sense of awe that like there's like this stuff out there that is like beyond under my understanding, kind of. And there's a lot of comfort to be taken in that like there's something beyond like there's something I could never understand. Kind of like there's this depth to existence that is just untouchable. And that feeling is something that we might kind of want to lean on. Like there's this untouchable depth to existence. I hate to repeated myself there, but
I mean,
I think that is it's just such a the only word I can come up with is like kind of a wonderful feeling, right? And I would say that something that is one of the more unpleasant thoughts is that there isn't an infinite depth. Like we could reach the point of understanding everything, and that would be just utterly terrible. What would you do? And that I brought that up as a like, well, if God understands everything, that's gotta suck. Like, but
but it almost seems like people, like what I'm describing and what you're describing, like people have kind of gone multiple ways with it. Like, you have the people that say like, well, this must be a simulation because it does seem like stuff is just kind of appearing out of nowhere. We don't, but I believe that, God can certainly make things appear out of nowhere, just things manifest or, stuff change. Not even like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing, but like, anyway, but so it would have the appearance of if you didn't think that God was doing it, you would come to the conclusion like this has to be some kind of simulated reality because this is just too weird. This. I was thinking about
Too weird.
a bar of gold.
Yeah.
I was thinking about a bar of gold, and I was praying for a bar of gold, and I was digging in my backyard, and I found a bar of gold. In my, something.
It's too.
It's
too
like
coincidence, too much.
Yeah. And then some people think like, well, the bar of gold wasn't there, but since it's a simulation, you were digging in your backyard and it appeared.
I just thought about the meaning of coincidence, like coincident, as in like
two
things. Two things intersect.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like
or synchronicities, like
interesting.
Synchronicities too, and
some very similar meaning to those.
And God wants us to think about all of these things.
Yeah.
And there are myriad references to that sort of thought in the Bible.
Yeah.
He wants us to use our brains and consider these things as we read the scriptures.
Not according to the Catholic Church for the majority of time.
That is an organized religion that's not making any statement about the Holy Scriptures. Just because some man-created organization makes a statement about the book does not make their
Catholics
statement the truth.
Rotating in their graves at you calling them their thing a man-created system.
Well, that's another discussion.
Not that I don't disagree. Not that I disagree.
That's another discussion.
Yeah.
That's.
They would argue that
we just lost half our audience.
Yeah. They would argue that they are the founding.
I don't want to
version of this of Christianity.
And to a great extent, that is true.
Well, you got
but
Orthodox.
The Catholic,
you've got
what we see as what we have come to know as the Catholic Church today, has virtually no resemblance to.
Is that true? I feel like they have the most resemblance to
have virtually no resemblance to the Catholic meaning universal church of
small C.
early Christianity in the 100s and 200s.
Yeah, because what do you do with the churches because there's the Ethiopian church, there's the church in India that was started by St. Thomas, that either predates the Roman Catholic or, was founded by one of the disciples that developed separately from.
That's very interesting.
I think it is because, we're Western and we kind of tend to think of, the Roman Catholic Church as being the oldest, but it really
isn't.
They claim that they are. They claim that Peter was their
but
first
that's
pope
not,
and all that.
But that's not
Yeah.
the reality.
Yeah.
I don't know. For me, and I had my own little thought process going on here, which led to this statement, I guess. But like, what made me, I was raised Christian, but going through the AP World History class, where I examined, or where it was in great depth pointed out to me, not in these exact words, but in great depth, pointed out to me that there were so many people that believed something so hard for so long, and in greater numbers than the religion of which I was part during much of history. And what makes me right, what makes them wrong, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you don't use the collective belief as a reason for belief, the number of people which believe it as a basis of your belief, then a lot of that tends to breakdown for me.
Well, that's a big discussion.
That is,
but,
yeah.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I definitely see that there are, God has revealed to everybody the truth that God exists, or all peoples. So there is there is the way, but I mean, you could see that there are glimmers of the truth to varying degrees in different faiths. Even if it is just that there is something more to our existence,
Yeah.
Or,
My own desire for that to be true causes me to examine it extraordinarily carefully. Like, it's such a strong desire within all of us, I think, that we must be very careful.
and that is not necessarily a bad thing.
No.
Unless you die on the way home.
Yeah. Well, on that note, examine these things.
And on that bombshell, Jeremy Clarkson.
But I guess we'll pick back up there, and we've got more in Exodus.
Have fun editing
going
this
forward. Yes, this is going to be. I might have this end discussion as a bonus section or something. So you will know by the time you hear this what we had decided to do. So thank you for listening. And I don't know if we exceeded our time that we did last time, but
maybe feels like it.
Perhaps.
Definitely, because I
2
think we
hours.
started at about 7. Yeah.
2 hours.
2 hours, world record. All right, so thank you again for listening, and we hope you have a good time.
Be blessed.
Be blessed.
Farewell.
Farewell.